Today we have with us Professor Nick Couldry and Dr. Ulises Mejias, and they will be speaking on the costs of connection, how data is colonizing human life and appropriating it for capitalism. Professor Nick Couldry is Professor of Media Communications and Social Theory at the Department of Media and Communications, the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is also Faculty Associate, Button Klein Center for Internet Society, Howard University. He's a sociologist of media and culture, and his analysis of media's practice has been widely influential. For instance, I'm using it for my own PhD research. He's authored several books, chapters, and journal articles in his two new books, Media, Why It Matters, published by Quality Press, and The Costs of Connection, with Dr. Mejias, published by Stanford University Press. Dr. Ulises Mejias is Associate Professor at Department of Communication Studies, State University of New York College at Oswego. He specializes in critical internet studies, and his current research interests are network theory and science, philosophy of technology, sociology of communication, and political economy of digital media. He is Director, Institute for Global Engagement, and also on the Board of Directors of Humanities New York. His last book was Off the Network, Disrupting the Digital World, published by University of Minnesota Press. Today, he'll discuss his latest book, co-authored with Professor Couldry. And we have a surprise for you. It will be announced by our speakers shortly. Hello, Professor Couldry and Dr. Mejias. Welcome. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Davina. Can you hear me okay? I'm checking you can. Thank you very much for the invite and all the hard work gone into creating this talk. We're very excited to do this today, and we also want to thank Professor Pavarala for originally organizing the tour to India that we would have taken in April if things had gone to plan. But sadly, they did not, but we hope to be back to India before too long to see you all again in person. What we want to do today, we'll talk for about 30 minutes, is to give you a sense of the argument of our new book. The question that we try to address in the book is basically a very simple one. What is going on with data? How should we frame the countless new and not so new developments with data in business, in government, in society, and in all of our personal lives? How should we make sense of this? Now, there are many ideas already on the table. Most of those ideas say that this is a new stage of capitalism, perhaps a digital capitalism, informational capitalism, platform capitalism, most famously surveillance capitalism, the theory of Shoshana Zuboff, or most simply data capitalism. And all of these ideas obviously say something very important, and we have much in common with them. But in our book, we ask whether something even bigger is going on with data today, something even larger, something truly momentous in world history, which will be a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. And we get hints of this link to capitalism and to colonialism in the business cliches of the past few years. For example, the phrase, data is the new oil, which was on the front page of The Economist magazine about 4 years ago. This phrase, data is the new oil, is it just a harmless metaphor? Or does this phrase offer a cover for a genuinely new reality that truly deserves the name colonialism, but whose actual workings must be covered up, if at all possible? That colonial framing also emerged in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which I'm sure you heard about around 2 years ago in March and April 2018, when Cambridge Analytica, a small company, was able to use Facebook data to draw up psychological profiles of hundreds of thousands of Facebook users and then to target at them political propaganda. The key person who broke the scandal was Christopher Wiley, who used to work for Cambridge Analytica. And a few weeks into the scandal, in response to queries about what Cambridge Analytica was doing in India, potentially to influence elections there, he said, well, they do have a project, and this is what modern colonialism looks like. But what could this actually mean?
So a central point in our argument is that this is not a metaphor. We're using the word colonialism not metaphorically, but to describe basically an emergent reality. We are basically talking about a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism that we're calling data colonialism. And this emerging phase is basically preparing the ground for a new mode of capitalist production, just like colonialism prepared the ground for industrial capitalism. We can sometimes think of those as two distinct eras, but we do well to recall that they overlapped, and in many cases, the plantations financed the factories. So colonialism generated the wealth that was necessary for the emergence of industrial capitalism. Now, data colonialism, we're also arguing, is unfolding while coexisting with the inequalities created during colonialism. So we have the legacy of underdevelopment, of racism, of violence. This new form of colonialism is being built on top of that. So it is deeply continuous with the goals of historic colonialism. Now, are we thus suggesting that we can expect to see the same levels of violence, particularly physical violence? No, we're not. We're not making a one-to-one comparison here. But we are saying that the impact of the social change is comparable. We are perhaps talking about different means, but similar ends. Now, let me give you then the definition of data colonialism that we're working with. We're saying it is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. Now, to make sense of this definition, we also need to understand the difference between colonialism and coloniality, which is a term that was developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. And his point was basically that in some ways, colonialism is over. Yes, we still have some territories that can be called colonies, Puerto Rico, Samoa, perhaps, but most of the colonies got their independence. However, Quijano was arguing that the legacy of colonialism very much continues to be with us. And this legacy, as we know, continues to shape, for instance, power relations, politics, global politics, race relations, even the construction of knowledge. So coloniality is a word he used to refer to this legacy. So we are arguing that there are differences. There are differences in terms of the modes, the intensities, the scales, and the context of colonialism. Those are different. Those are not the same of what we're seeing today. But we are saying that there is one clear similarity, and that is the historical function of colonialism. And that function is to dispossess. The old colonialism grabbed land, it grabbed territory. The new one grabs us, our social lives, through basically the medium of data. So how is this being rationalized or justified? Part of the reason this new colonialism is so effective is that it is based in new rationalities that have linkages to old rationalities. These new economic, legal, technological rationalities, in other words, have a very deep colonial past. Let's start with cheap nature. Now, in order to colonize the world, nature had to be framed as cheap. It had to be framed as abundant, as free. From a legal perspective, it had to be framed as having no owner, right? At least a civilized owner. So we have the concept of terra nullius, which is Latin, which basically means no man's land. It is what allowed Europeans to go into different territories and claim them as their own, even if they were inhabited by people, but those people, of course, were rendered as uncivilized. Their rights over the land didn't matter. The next step was cheap labor. Some humans in colonialism, especially determined by their race, were meant to provide the labor required to transform nature into wealth. So in this way, exploitation and abuse were framed as social progress. This was being done for the good of humanity. Of course, religion played a large part in rationalizing this, and to this, we continue to see it to this day, in the way in which, for instance, certain minerals are extracted for the production of our digital devices. So we have this progression from cheap nature to cheap labor, and now we have cheap data. Cheap data shares some of the same extractive rationalities that we have been discussing in terms of labor and nature. It is rendered or is framed as abundant, free, just there for the taking, and without an owner, at least in its aggregate form. Yes, we produce it individually, but collectively it is said to have no owner, which is why then corporations, states, can accumulate it and process it. It needs processing. It needs certain technological know-how that we as individuals don't have. So our job basically is only to generate it, we are told. We are told that this is what progress looks like. But what do we gain by looking at things this way?
Well, our book wants to challenge all of those rationalities of extraction: cheap land, cheap labor, cheap data. And we recognize, though, that it's uncomfortable, it's unsettling to compare what's going on with data in the global north and the global south to colonialism. So what overall are the advantages of this approach? The first approach is in terms of timescale. A colonial approach means understanding what's going on with data in terms of not just the past 40 years of the internet and social media, but the past 500 years. And it also means looking forward further ahead into the future than just the next year or two. It means seeing data, what's happening with data, as a new historical form of resource extraction, just as world-changing potentially as the conquest of the resources of the Americas 500 years ago. And it also means imagining that what's going on now with the seizure of data could be laying the stage for a new capitalism that we can't even fully anticipate yet, just as historical colonialism made possible the industrial capitalism that came 200 years later. The second advantage of a colonial approach is that it broadens our sense of the scope of what's going on with data. What's going on with data is not just, in our view, a rogue variant of capitalism in the way Shoshana Zuboff sees it. It's a problem with the direction of capitalism everywhere and in every aspect, its new relationship to data, which operates not just in relation to social media platforms, obviously important though they are, but it operates, for example, in the fact that more and more workers are being subject to intense moment-to-moment surveillance in every moment of their working lives. It refers to the growth of the gig economy, which many people celebrate as a form of freedom. It refers to the growth of logistics over the past 30, 40 years across everywhere in industry, but at the same time always involving more and more surveillance of workers. And finally, and least noticed of all, data colonialism involves the seizure of internal corporate data. IBM, not a company with social media platforms, said 3 or 4 years ago in its annual report that 80% of the world's really valuable data is internal corporate data. And the colonial perspective also means we can think about the complexity of today's new form of colonialism, which is both external and internal. To some degree, that was true of historic colonialism. But now that doubleness of colonialism is intensified because we have two global colonial poles, the USA and China, and the extraction of data internal to societies is going on everywhere, whether they're colonizing societies or colonized societies. So in some sense, this is more complex than the early forms of historical colonialism. So those are a first set of advantages in terms of the scope and scale. There's a second set of advantages in terms of the depth at which we see what's going on with data, because the new colonial way of analyzing this enables us to look at a new social order, the creation of a new social order through data extraction involving new forms of dependency, new forms of governing people based on convenience and habit, but always, of course, reinforcing older inequalities of class, gender, and race. And finally, the biggest continuity that we start to see if we adopt a colonial frame of analysis is the continuation of the West's 500-year-old attempt to impose one single version of rationality onto the world. We see this in the rhetorics to do with data, the rhetorics of big data, tech for public health, which continue, in our view, the entanglements of power and knowledge and rationality that have gone on throughout modernity and in which colonialism has always been a central part. This is the core, if you like, the so-called rational core of coloniality. To understand, though, what's going on with data on a practical level, we also need to draw creatively on the best theories for understanding capitalism, because what's happening with data is both a new form of colonialism and a continuation of capitalism. And that means going back to Marx. Marx's theory of how capitalism is reproduced was in terms of labor relations. And for sure, they remain very important. They're being newly datafied. But this emerging social order of data simply cannot be understood fully anymore just through labor relations. Its scope is much wider than that. We have to understand it, we argue in the book, also through a new type of social relation, which we call data relations. Data relations which reconfigure social life exactly so as to optimize the extraction of data for profit. And we've developed that idea inspired by one of the great critical Marxist thinkers, Moshe Postone, who died just 2 years ago, who argued that the fundamental characteristic of capitalism and how it can be socially reproduced is not, in fact, labor relations, as most people think. It's not even the commodification of labor. It's something which makes the commodity possible, which is the abstracting force of the commodity, the possibility of turning the messy stuff of everyday life and activity into something abstract which can be sold on a market for a fixed value as a commodity. And this, of course, links to the absolute core of datafication, which is transforming our life processes into something abstract, into something as abstract as data, which can be sold potentially for value. This means that our ordinary social life becomes a direct factor of capitalist production. Marx described something a little like this when he talked about capitalism and agriculture in Europe in the 19th century, when he pointed out that seeds and manure from cows, which previously was just plowed back into the land or used in the natural process, suddenly became commodified, suddenly acquired an abstract value, became catalyzed. That, we argue, is exactly what is happening to human life today, through the continuous monitoring of our lives and the attempts of marketers to influence us. Now, we know on a daily basis how this happens. Every time we accept the terms and services of an app or a platform or a smart device, we fall back into the spiral of data relations. And usually this happens quite peacefully. And that leads to a crucial point, that historical colonialism was extraction based on no pre-existing social relations at all, around about 1500. That meant that violence and deception were the only ways of seizing the gold. But let's remember, data colonialism builds on 2 centuries of capitalist social relations. So no physical violence is actually necessary. Just a small tweak in the background legal conditions of what we do on our phones is enough to change fundamentally our relations to our own social and personal life.
So who is behind this process? In the book, we didn't just want to talk about internet companies in general, or even specific locations like Silicon Valley. So instead, we came up with a term, the social quantification sector, to describe all of these players. The SQS is the industry sector devoted to the development of the infrastructure required for extraction. Now, in the sector, of course, we do have some of the big players that we're used to seeing, GAFA, or Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. We also have big players in China, as Nick mentioned, because those are the two poles of the emerging data colonialism. So in China, we have Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi, companies that in many ways match the scope and the power of their counterparts in the West. What's interesting about these companies is that they function as hybrids of monopoly and monopsony. Now, a monopoly is a word I'm assuming everybody can recognize. It's a market structure characterized by the presence of a single seller. A monopsony is also a term from economics that is a little bit less common, and it describes a market structure characterized by the presence of a single buyer, not a single seller, but a single buyer. And so in this day and age, when we're all media producers, we upload videos, we post pictures, we update our status in Facebook and Twitter. We are all producers, but there's only one or a handful of buyers who acquire, many times at no cost, all of our content. So these companies are acting both as monopolies, but also as monopsonies, buying all of the content that we produce. There are, of course, players of many different sizes and industries. So we include in the social quantification sector also the hardware manufacturers, the software manufacturers, the platforms like Netflix, like Facebook that we have been talking about, as well as companies dedicated to data analytics, the companies that might collect and analyze the data and then sell the results to a third party, as well as the data brokerage companies. So again, it's not just about the surveillance industry. We're trying to be much more encompassing than that. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about the coloniality of data relations. Because in the book, we conduct various transhistorical comparisons using the past to understand the coloniality of data relations in the present. And we organize these comparisons using the same 4X game plan found in strategy video games. The 4 X's are explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. In a strategy video game, like the one you see in the background here, this is what you're supposed to do. The game in the background is Sid Meier's Civilization, the title specifically dealing with colonization. So in the colonialism video game, you can choose to play the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, or the French. And your goal is to apply these strategies, explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate to conquer the world. The world, of course, the people, the resources are not players, they're just controlled by the computer. So they have limited agency. Now, we don't have a lot of time to do each one of these strategies, so let's just concentrate on a couple. Let's start with explore. And what I want to do here is just briefly compare two historical documents. The first one you see here is excerpts from Google's Terms of Service for installing the Chrome web browser. In case you, like most of us, haven't read it, here's what it says in part. Quote, you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. It's quite extensive, and this is just part of it. I want to compare that to another document called the requerimiento, which translating it from Spanish would mean something like the demand or the requirement. This is a document that was read by Spanish conquistadors as they were colonizing the New World. They would arrive to villages and cities, sometimes in the middle of the night, and proceed to read this document in Spanish to a non-Spanish speaking audience before, going into the city with their weapons to colonize it. This is what the requerimiento read in part. If you do not submit, I certify to you, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods, and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. The Spanish Requerimiento, 1513. Please click there to accept and install. So our point is that we're not saying what happened after the Requerimiento was read is exactly the same thing that happens after we install Google Chrome, but we're calling attention, in this case, to the use of misleading and abstract language to perform that original trick of dispossessing. I'll talk a little bit also about extermination. And in the book, of course, we do reference some of the important work that's happening in this area by theorists and scholars and activists who are talking about the new weapons of colonization. We're trying to describe basically the map for invasion of the space of the self that is happening. And one useful comparison is perhaps to look at the Leyes de las Indias, which is this legal document you see in front of you, which regulated the exploitation of the mines in the New World. As you know, the mines in Mexico, in Bolivia, generated immense wealth, gold and silver and other rich minerals that were then brought back to Europe. Now, what's interesting about this legal document is that, in theory, it gives the indigenous people a right to own and to exploit their own wealth. Much like perhaps Mark Zuckerberg tells us today, it's your data. It belongs to you. In theory, we're just doing the work of processing it. And so, of course, we know that in practice, that doesn't work out the same way. And the mines in Mexico and Bolivia were horrible places to work in. The life expectancy for the men, women, and children who would arrive to work there was 4 years. After 4 years, people would basically die. So our point is that this kind of exploitation, colonialism has always created what Naomi Klein calls sacrifice zones. And today, those sacrifice zones are our everyday lives. So we're saying that what data colonialism exterminates are alternative ways of thinking and being. As we know, in colonialism, it's the mind, not just the body, that is a vulnerable site of colonization, much like Ashish Nandy describes in The Intimate Enemy. Today we have new kinds of intimate enemies that undermine our freedom.
Now, there's one other aspect of our theory of data colonialism that we just briefly want to mention, which is its deep impact on the human subject. In chapter 5 of the book, we ask what philosophical resources could help us grasp what is happening and what will happen to us through data colonialism. And we turn to the concept of freedom. We don't mean here the thin concept of consumer freedom, but something deeper, the relational freedom that I recognize in you and you recognize in me as subjects in social space. And here to develop this, we have to turn to a figure who's definitely problematic, which is the German philosopher Hegel from the 19th century, who was almost certainly a strong supporter of historic colonialism. Hegel said that freedom is the freedom to be with oneself in the other. It sounds very abstract, but it comes down to two things. In the other is the social relations out of which I come to feel myself to be free. The key bit, though, is what he says in the first part of the phrase, to be with oneself. In the German, it's alongside oneself. The idea here is that I cannot be free if I know that there's something external, perhaps some external institution, which is interfering between me and my relations with myself, my sense of what I think, my sense of what my goals are, my sense of whether I'm in love with a person or whether I grieve for another person. This idea, this fundamental idea of the basic core space of the self, which must not be interfered with, is held in common with a philosopher from outside the West, Enrique Dussel from Mexico and Argentina, who tried to develop his philosophy against the core models and the domination of Western philosophy, but whose view of freedom also was based on what he called the natural substantivity of the person, that basic space of the self. And with this approach to freedom, we can ask a key question about the ways that markets track us and seek to influence us every moment of the day. Because if under these new conditions, I can no longer be with myself without some external system intervening, am I any longer a self at all? What if surveillance, self-tracking, the psychometric algorithms that advertisers are more and more using to try and influence, or what the legal scholar Karen Jung calls the hypernudge, what if all of this were leading towards an erosion of what we call in the book the minimal integrity of the self as a self? Now, we're certainly not saying that the impact on freedom in practice is going to be the same for everyone. Yes, data colonialism is a very general change in the conditions of the life of human subjects, but there's no doubt also that it is a tool to reproduce and build old and new forms of inequality of race, class, and gender, reinforcing, of course, the historic colonial legacy. But now it's time to conclude, so I'll hand over to Ulises.
Thanks. So, how do we begin to resist this order, which we have been describing for the last 25 minutes and which sounds quite oppressive? How do we decolonize data, in other words? Well, the first thing is that we have to realize we're talking about a multifaceted problem, which amalgamates basically 500 years of injustices. So for that reason, one-track approaches and quick solutions are not going to work. Yes, we have to remain involved in our societies to push for regulation. And we also have to practice different ways of opting out, perhaps. I'm not on Facebook myself, but I know for political reasons, many activists are, and my students use it to stay in touch with their families, so I don't tell them to abandon Facebook. But by themselves, these boutique forms of activism are not going to be enough. Basically, we have to reclaim colonized space and time. We have to do this to protect the space of the self that Nick was just talking about. So the colonized space, the space colonized by surveillance cameras, the space colonized by digital assistants in our kitchens or in our bedrooms. We have to reclaim some of that. The colonized time that we spend in front of screens, sometimes bordering in addiction. We have to also reclaim some of that. We have to reject the universal rationality of data collection and extraction that tells us that this is for our good, this is for the good of humanity, this is what allows us to continue to communicate, perhaps even during times of isolation, like right now. And lastly, we have to learn, we argue, from the colonial struggles of the past. Some people have centuries of experience standing up to colonialism. We have to learn how these struggles reappropriated certain technologies, took them and used them for something that they were not intended to be used as, how they reconceptualized forms of common knowledge, how they built new forms of solidarity, all by using a very important weapon against colonialism, and that is imagination. Decolonizing data is primarily an exercise in creativity, we're saying, about collectively imagining what disconnection looks like and what new forms of connection look like. Something, again, particularly important during a lockdown. We're gonna stop there and take questions, please. We're also posting, as you can see on this slide, 30% discount code. So if you're interested in buying our book, please make sure you use this code. And I believe this information is also going to be posted on the chat window. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, sirs. In a permanently online, permanently connected world, even more so due to COVID-19, this presentation touches on the important aspect of data colonialism and explains data's role in the social order of contemporary capitalism. Now, as mentioned, the authors have secured a 30% discount on the normal book price for those attending this event and watching the recording later. I'm posting the link in code in chat now. There you go. And we'll have live questions from the Zoom meeting participants shortly. And Nick sir, Ulises sir, I will ask you all the Zoom chat and FB live comment questions towards the end of the meeting. Now, I already have a few requests for questions, but I officially open the forum for participants to raise their hands, and I will announce your names in order. And in case you can't find exactly where you have to raise your hand, please let me know via personal message that you would like to ask a question. Kindly turn on your microphone and or video depending on your connection when it is your turn to ask. Please keep your questions as brief as possible so we can have maximum interaction. And we will be taking questions starting now for the next 15 minutes only to manage time better, although Professor Couldry and Dr. Mejias have promised already to extend the time of this talk in case we have a lot of questions. So here is the order. For once, the person at back end, I'm gonna like push them up on the question list. So Pranay, if you're there, so Pranay handles our back end. Yes, if you could please.
Okay,
Yes.
I have the privilege of asking the first question. I'm online. So when I was looking at some of the companies you mentioned, one of them is Xiaomi, and I don't know. Recently, Facebook purchased 9.99% of Reliance Jio, which is one of the largest telecom providers in India. And Xiaomi is by far the best-selling phone in India. I mean, it is. I think their models outsell everybody 1:10 or something like that. That's they are probably the most popular phone. I mean, some of the channels that they are sold on reported to be the best overall. So in such a case, where the stakes of data collection, organizations which basically survive on data collection, their stakes are in hardware, and some places you really don't have a choice because of the price and because of so many other factors. Like if I'm using, for example, I'm using, the Geo mobile service provider, and just by buying or purchasing their service for a cell phone connection, and I agree to their terms and conditions. I mean, how do we avoid that? I mean, I cannot say that I cannot reject that because I'm using that phone. I mean, or I'm using that service, and I cannot reject that service because I need to use it. So I mean, it's different from Facebook where I have to accept, create an account, and here I may not have a choice anymore. So what I mean, how do we combat that, or how do we work around that? That's my question.
Well, Nick, do you want to go first? Or?
Oh, no, happy for you too.
Okay, thank you very much for that question and comment. And we agree. I mean, we try to be in the book as specific as possible and in our arguments, because you're right that it's not just a case where everyone suffers the same consequences. And that's where I think we look particularly at the work of people like Virginia Eubanks or Sophia Noble, who describe basically that the populations more at risk are, no surprise, the same populations who have always been at risk during colonialism, in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity sometimes. So you're right that when you buy a phone, and some people can afford a cheaper phone, can only afford a cheaper phone, it comes with certain already capabilities for data colonialism built in terms of the extraction of data. And some people like to say, well, there are good companies like Apple who don't capture your data. I mean, they do capture it, they just use it for different purposes. But Apple products are more expensive. So you are buying, in essence, that privacy and security. And so for many of the people who can't afford that price, it is true that then they are exposed to different ways of data collection without protection. Nick, you want to add anything?
I think the only thing I'd add is to link this to the point that Ulises made at the end about imagination. So we don't for one moment underestimate the difficulties of these situations. It's extremely difficult to resist a sort of power that is based in fundamental convenience. That's what we mean by the costs of connection. However, it just so happens that India is one of the very few countries in the world that has successfully resisted data colonialism of this sort, in terms of the resistance initially to the Facebook Free Basics proposal 3 or 4 years ago, when on the face of it, what was being offered was just cheap internet, the most basic form of connection. It's often thought that it probably more went to the middle classes rather than the working classes who couldn't even afford this cheap form, but nonetheless it was seen to be important. But the imagination of Indian civil society saw behind this a different type of offer, an attempt to grab the data of Indian citizens, and it said no. It used the legal resources of a highly sophisticated society with a very strong legal structure to resist, but based on that act of imagination. And that's why we stress the imagination. If we don't have the imagination to see beyond the apparent double bind we're all in, then we have no hope. But we do have that imagination. And India proved that 3 or 4 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Okay, next we have Usha ma'am online. If you could please turn on, yes, there you are.
Ah, hi.
Yeah. Hi. So thank you so much for that talk. And to some extent, my question was sort of answered in the last slide, but my question really is, by focusing so much on the what of data colonialism, do we somehow lose the ability to see how data becomes data? And is that a site of possible resistance? I mean, I can see that resistance needs to come from multiple spaces, as again you pointed out, but is this, how might we look at the becoming of data as a site of resistance?
Shall I start this time, Ulises? Again, that's an important question. If we could stop things at source, that will be fundamentally important. I agree completely with that. And I think something that's unusual about our approach compared with most other critical approaches to data is that we emphasize exactly this problem at source. And we're in favor of laws potentially being thought about, which actually block the gathering of certain types of data, which may be a psychically corrosive, which intrude into our personal lives in a totally unacceptable way. So I think we have to ask exactly that question. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's easy to do this if you don't have laws to make things illegal. That's the more difficult bit. And of course, we know that data is gathered in all sorts of indirect ways. Often advantages are offered. So if you have your employer says, I want to give you a good deal for health insurance in the workplace, which is very important to have. But to do it, to advantage it, you have to use the Apple Watch, or you have to have a Fitbit so that I can keep the cost down because my insurer has done a deal with them. Then again, you don't have much chance to renegotiate the terms and conditions of Fitbit or Apple Watch. So it becomes very difficult even to ask that basic question, well, why should my data be taken? And that's where I think the colonial framework is important, because it was complex, but ultimately deeply deceitful offers of this sort that were offered at the very beginning of historical colonialism, before it became locked in as a set of institutions. If you go right to the beginning, these were just the sorts of deals of apparent advantage that were offered to trick the key moment, which was the transferring over of what was not for the was not to be taken, but was taken. Mm-hmm. So you've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly where we need to look.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Sanjay sir next. If you could come online, please. You need to turn off your microphone. Yes, there you are.
Able to hear me?
Yes.
Professor Nick, the question is, do we take off from part of your argument on colonization and the structure of news agencies and the commercial interests that began? And for example, Sandage talks about the Victorian internet, and Samuel Potter has also made some analysis. Yeah. My question is that if the argument is accepted, it means that bulk of the data we are engaging in is just trivia, and the corporates are getting away with extraction, labor, and other decisions based on premium information that news agencies are supplying to them. Did you get it, sir?
I couldn't quite hear. I found it difficult to hear the end and exactly what your question.
I was talking about the transition of the news agencies like Reuters,
yes,
which have moved away from news agencies as a very trivial business and gone to geostrategic and political intelligence gathering, which is supplied to the corporates at a very high premium.
That's a very interesting point. I think you're right to bring out that, and this fits with the idea that something very large is going on in here. This is not a minor variation in the terms of capitalism. This is a fundamental renegotiation and expansion of the assets available to capitalism, that these are destabilizing journalism, because journalists are now told they have to tell stories which play well on social media. And I don't know much about what you're saying, but it sounds extremely interesting that Reuters, which was there to generate high quality news based on actual journalists finding out of what was going on in the world, are actually finding it's more profitable to harvest data, to package it in a form like data brokers that can be sold at a high profit. This is a very serious danger, but similar things are going on, of course, linked to the advertising industry in general, that apparently trivial information about where I am at any one moment, whether I'm picking up an apple or an orange, apparently trivial, can be added together and aggregated into data that is genuinely valuable about me. And that, of course, is the big trick involved in the harvesting, the turning of the raw stuff, as it were, of my life into something that has been transmuted into something valuable that can either be sold for profit. And that's, again, one reason why it seems to be innocent to give up this stuff. And that's why a lot of corporate rhetoric talks about the data exhaust. We just give it off anyway. It doesn't go anywhere. So what's the problem in some good company taking it and making something useful out of it? And unless you deconstruct the ideology at the root of that, you can't argue with that. But of course, my life is not my exhaust. It's just my life. It's my life, and it's not anyone else's. And I don't see why I should give off any of its emanations for profit to me at all, because my life is not part of a profit machine. So we have to challenge this at its core, as Usha was also saying. We have to do that. And I think the colonial frame enables us to challenge this at its core. So thank you for that point.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
We have Anjali ma'am next for her question.
Hi, professors. Such an insightful lecture. Thank you for that. Just wanted to ask a very basic question, I think. In a way, inequality has existed in human society for eons. You know, colonialism in a way has existed for women for ages. So in the future, when, let's say, climate change intensifies, and it's likely that we'll have other different kinds of colonialism also, for example, water colonialism. So when we study data colonialism, should the focus and vigilance not be firmly on colonialism itself, rather than, you know, so much of energy going into what kind and, you know, this new form of colonialism?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that's somewhat the argument that we are trying to make in linking how colonialism and capitalism relate to each other in new ways. And so I think in one of the slides, I did try to make the point that we sometimes historically think of colonialism and capitalism as discrete eras, and they have very little to do with each other. When in fact, I think there's new ways of thinking about it, not just from us, but from other scholars and theorists as well, that you cannot have basically one without the other. And whereas capitalism might look very different for someone in the center of the empire, the extraction that happens, the exploitation that happens at the peripheries in the colonies is essential to how capitalism grows and develops. So you are correct in pointing out that what we're presenting is just one part of the equation, and the extractivism continues in other parts as well. And if we look at the environment, that's a very important area where we need to also look at, obviously, the extractivism that is happening there. So our argument is basically about connecting what is happening with data to the overall process of extraction.
If I could just add one sentence to that, because I think, Anjali, you have raised a very big point, so perhaps it's good if both of us respond to this one. Obviously, what Ulises has said is absolutely right, but if we turn it another way, because we understand this can sound a little paradoxical, as if we're presenting some entirely new thing, data colonialism, whereas what we're saying, this is exactly the old thing, colonialism. But what is new, and it really is profoundly new, is it's operating in a new dimension. It's operating in the dimension of our lives, our everyday experience, through the new medium of data. And that means that colonialism has acquired a further dimension. And we think that's historically enormously important. We have to bring it out. And that's really where our focus is, hence all the historical comparisons that Ulises went through, of which there are many more in the book. Because if we don't spot that, then we are in the dark, and this is going to happen without us resisting it. And that we think will be very, very dangerous.
Thank you so much.
So we have Venu ma'am next for the live Q&A.
Thank you, Divina, and thank you, professors, for that really wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question is, I mean, we're working at the forefront of this, and Nick, I've read your work on voice and why voice matters, and a lot of our media literacy work began after the Facebook Cambridge Analytica broke out, and we feel that media literacy has been one way to kind of bring this argument of data colonialism to those who have not had a voice yet. And over the last 5-6 years, our effort was to enable that voice. And because the listening was happening through a lot of social media, I mean, I'm using the in quotes listening, it was important to have these voices here. So it's a catch-22. And I'm wondering, just taking off from what you've spoken today, is whether this colonialism that you're talking about is also infiltrating or in some way paralleling the development space, where the space that is meant to provide equality and justice is in some way feeding back into this power structure. And, how can we then also reimagine those spaces? Sorry if that was a little obtuse.
Not at all. Ulysses, do you want to? You don't?
Well, I would just shortly say, point out to the image we started book with a quote from Native American activist Leanne Simpson, who reflects precisely on this issue. The fact that as part of the Idle No More movement in Canada, they had to use all of the social media tools, Facebook and Twitter. And while at the moment it felt it served a particular purpose, later the movement itself was reflecting on whether it had been worth it, or at least reflecting on how the act itself of using these platforms in some ways ensured the continuation of the very problem that they were fighting against. So I think that's a very useful image, but at the same time, I think from an activist point of view, it makes sense to use the tools that are going to have an impact. So we're not saying, we should all abandon Facebook and Google and Amazon tomorrow because we can't. Nick?
Yeah, just going back to the media literacy point, we do come at that towards the end of the book when we talk about reimagining the terms of common knowledge, which is one key way where we can reimagine that, how we resist data colonialism, which is to think about how we're connected and to help each other imagine a society where we were not so dependent on these tools, even though in the short term we have no choice. On the development space, a number of people have started to comment on that, like Lynette Taylor, for example, on the role of data collection in the development space. Now, in some ways, they've read that just as continuing colonialism in an era that's saturated with colonialism, which is the idea of development. But again, what I think the data colonialism approach adds is that there's a new dimension of that now, which is that the very stuff of knowledge that is obviously essential for any area like development, to know what is going on and what is a problem, is now saturated with this new colonial expanse of data extraction. So you can't even get development funding anymore unless you agree that the relevant populations are tracked through various devices. And this is a massive new level, if you like, of symbolic violence that is going on at the heart of the development sector that is meant to, in some sense, be helping people and addressing social problems. So it is an interesting area, yeah.
Right. We have Vinod sir next for his question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Ah, yes.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much, Ulises and Nick, for that presentation. So many of us are sort of responding to what you have presented. I mean, of course, it's an invitation to read the full book and understand the complexities of the argument you're making. I'm responding to your call for decolonizing data, which came towards the end of the talk, and specifically to the call for rejecting universal rationality of data. So obviously, I mean, rejecting universal rationality doesn't mean rejection of rationality. So what would be the epistemological or political components of this coming resistance? Do people base it on what some scholars have called situated knowledges, standpoint epistemologies? What are the components of this sort of counter-hegemonic rationality that you're positing?
Well, in some ways, we end the book with that because I think it's a work in progress in the sense that we haven't worked out all of the specifics. And I think it's not obviously up to us to be the only ones doing that. I think hopefully from this point, it becomes more of a dialogue in which different voices can be heard and different voices can contribute to it. Because I think it's going to take all of the things that you mentioned and more, as long as we remember that one-track approaches are not going to work, I think we should let 1,000 flowers bloom. And this is exactly what I think is required and has always, to the extent that struggles for decolonization have worked, is because they're always encompassing in this broad way. Nick, what would you like to?
Well, just one sentence on the rationality point, because Vinod, what you said at the beginning is really important, and we emphasize it too, that to challenge the universal rationality that you only know the world if you gather exhaustive data about it, which is a very standard corporate developmental position now, very powerfully backed by the World Bank, UNDP, and so on. To challenge that is absolutely not to reject rationality. And that's in fact the point made by Aníbal Quijano, the Peruvian sociologist who Ulises mentioned. And one of his most important points: why should those who are trying to resist power on the scale give up the possibility of being rational? That's insane. That's to give up everything. So this is not a postmodern attempt to say we don't need it's absolutely not. But it is an attempt to contest powerful forms of rationality, the intersection of rationality and power, to open up spaces for alternative rationalities which recognize difference in much more profound ways. So it's the start of a very, very long conversation about how to do this, for sure. We just provide the beginnings in our book, but you're right to say this is a long struggle that we need to all engage in from wherever we are in the world.
Thank you.
Right, so we're now moving to questions from Zoom chat and comments on Facebook Live. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to club questions which sort of form a sort of thematic flow. And I'm sorry if there's an overlap with questions that have already been asked, but I think the overlap will help students sort of wrap their minds around the concepts that are being discussed. So also, we are a little over the usual time that we have this talk for, but since Professor Couldry and Dr. Mejias have already given us permission, participants, I ask permission from you as well. In case you already have time in your schedule for something else, please feel free to leave the meeting and watch the recording later. But we will continue till we have all the questions answered today. So I'm just posting in chat Nick sir and Ulises sir. We have a mix of questions here from Preeti, who's a alumna, Hasina, who's a current PhD student, and Mukesh and Sushmita have posted from Facebook and Zoom respectively. So they are essentially asking us if there are some individual practices or some policy or regulation that we can do in the interest of decolonizing data. And what happens to the second order value of voice under the new order of social relations dictated by data groups. So Preeti is asking about policy and regulation. And then Mukesh is asking about how individual could resist data scrutiny. And Sushmita is asking again about individual practices. And Hasina is asking about the second order value of voice.
Okay. Do you want to do the policy one, Ulises?
Sure, I can say something on that?
The voice one, obviously, and maybe the practice.
Okay,
Yeah. Do you want to
sure.
start?
Okay. Well, I think, again, we have to remember, if we look at the 500-year history of colonialism, that unfortunately is not like one law, one individual, one movement was able to upend the whole system. So these are deeply entrenched problems that are going to take a long time to address. And so when it comes to regulation, I think we do have to keep that in mind. I think we have seen some creative approaches from the European Union and also from countries like India, other countries where sometimes it looks like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or the other way. So regulation and deregulation is important. But we do have to remember that colonialism is always a partnership between the state and the corporation. It was so in the days of the East India Company. And in some ways, when we look at the very intimate linkages between, for instance, the big corporations that we mentioned, Google and Apple, and the government, it should give us pause, and it should be a place where we analytically look at those connections. So regulation can serve as the first step in making sure corporations are accountable, as the first step in making sure individuals have rights. But historically, regulation has actually gone the other way, at least in the United States, at least when it comes to the media. Deregulation has served to allow corporations to become bigger and to acquire more power. That has been true for the last few decades when it comes to traditional broadcast media. And unfortunately, we're seeing that it is a continuation when it comes to this new media and when it comes to data. So it's something where we as citizens will have to be involved and play a larger role. But I also don't want us to forget the other element of it, which is, the creativity, the cultural resistance, the imagination. We cannot just leave it to the lawyers and to the activists who care about the law to solve this huge problem.
Yes, and just building on what Ulises just said about imagination, and moving on to the 2 questions about practice, and I'll come to Hazima's question about voice in a minute. So what we're saying about individual practice is that it's not easy to act alone. Yes, I can choose to not use Facebook tomorrow or not use Twitter, but there will be costs for me, and no one will help me deal with those costs. And they could be significant costs if I have young children and they expect me to do various things and so on. Now, we recognize that. That's why we don't ask any individuals to do specific things. And we put the emphasis on collective solidarity and imagination. We have to help each other deal with these individual costs. Otherwise, we have no chance. But that's not so different from any large-scale social struggle. It's true, though, and Mukesh mentioned data security. There are obviously certain things that individuals can do. They can block ads on their phone or their laptop. They can obfuscate and give off false data, maybe. That might have some impact, and so on and so forth. But again, these forces are so large that we need to remember that for example, the advertising industry already takes account of the fact that most ads are blocked, and it finds other ways of reaching you on other devices, whether you use Bluetooth on your phone and so on and so forth. It can find ways around this. So this is a very difficult struggle for an individual to win. We need to recognize that, I think. Moving on to the point about voice, Hazina's point about voice. This is a very obviously, that's relating to my preceding work. That is a very difficult question. And as we're saying, we're just in the early days of this. So we don't quite know how this will work out in terms of voice. And we know that many forms of operating online give us voice. People are silent. Now suddenly they're in Zoom conversations, or their blog is read by some people and so on. One shouldn't neglect the importance of that. But our core concern is the data colonialism's new power in the area of social knowledge. the ability of faceless data brokers to determine the sorts of data that goes into deciding whether you get a loan or whether you get a mortgage or whether you get a place in a hospital or not. All of that, in the end, will work unless we resist it to the undermining of the voice that comes through the use of our voices, speaking directly to government, speaking in demonstrations, and so on and so forth. Our voice in a demonstration may come to be much less important than the trace of our face in a security camera amalgamated in wider databases which are used to track us. And this is the real threat to democracy that's emerging. It's going to take a while to become fully clear, but there are plenty of signs this is the direction we're going in, which is the long-term erasure of the traditional form of freedom, which is the exercise of the human voice.
Right. So what I'm doing is I'm posting the next set of questions which fall together. So Bikram and Ramakrishnan sir are both in a way asking you that our understanding of colonialism and the post-liberalism era in our part of the global south came in quite late. So our perspectives are slightly different. The way we understand these changes are slightly different. Versus data colonialism itself, our unpacking of it has happened quite quickly. So as Ramakrishnan sir points out, it's only 20 years into its rollout, and we're already sort of trying to unravel what it's doing to us and how it's affecting us. So how do third world countries go from cultural to commercial, as per Bikram? And as Ramakrishnan sir asks, does this materiality ask us, allow us to impact the way it rolls out from here? So it's about resistance again.
What do you think,
Yeah.
Ulises?
Well, yeah, these are very good points. And I particularly appreciate the point about giving an end to colonialism, which happened quite late. Obviously, no one in 1493 started talking about colonialism. It took a couple of centuries to understand this phenomena. And in the book, that's why we're particularly careful about not calling this just a new form of capitalism, because I think it's become usual business to take whatever's going on in the last few years and brand a new type of capitalism. What we're saying is that basically we don't know what this new type of capitalism will look like. Just like people didn't necessarily have a grasp that the accumulation of wealth that happened during colonialism was going to finance basically industrial capitalism, as I said during the presentation, how the plantations financed the factories. And that happened, those dynamics coexisted for a while, and then capitalism arrived and was seen as, in some ways, erasing the violence of the previous system. We don't know exactly what form all of that is going to play out. We do know that corporations like Google, corporations like Amazon, are amassing immense wealth. How that wealth will change social dynamics, how that wealth will change the environment, how it will change politics, I think remains to be seen. But it is also true that at least we are aware of these dynamics. The dynamics of extraction are not new and incomprehensible to us. And so hopefully by being engaged from this early point, we can still do something about it. Nick?
Yes, if I perhaps can go back to Bikram's question, what I think you're talking about is the role of global marketers in spreading data colonialism, and this is extremely important point, and it's not just about marketing of devices and internet access and so on, but it's marketing in general. There's a revolution going on in US and European marketing, and I don't know how far this is spreading to India, but I'm sure it is already, and it will continue, which is transforming marketing industry from making global general messages, often TV ads and so on, which are products that hope to reach a mass market, but may or may not, but that's the risk that marketers take, to a sort of continuous tracking of people as they're online at all moments of the day, where the real value is nothing creative, but it is the gathering together of data inferences to predict behavior and so on. This is a radically new idea of marketing. Now, of course, it's not one that on the face of it sounds very attractive. Global surveillance isn't something that it's easy to sell as a nice add-on to everyday life. So it has to be covered up as something else in terms of personalization. And the argument is, well, if you have a digital personal assistant in your house, you'll be able to get what you want quicker. You just speak into it, and that data will train the machine, and you'll get your stuff arriving quicker and so on, and you'll be cool, and everyone will think you're smart and so on. So these are personalized in various ways, but this is a very deceptive sugar coating on top of what is basically data extraction and turning the raw stuff of everyday life into an asset for capitalism. So I think you're right. Global marketing is an area that has to be looked at particularly closely, and not least because the rationales it uses about trying to understand us as individuals better are very much linked to claims of science today. Neuromarketing is a growth area, which endorses continuous extraction of data on the basis that this is how we understand the real insides of human beings and their brains. But this is very much an ideology of big data, which is continuous with 5 centuries of extraction and rationalities of extraction. And again, it needs to be uncovered, and its alliance with marketing needs to be deconstructed. And this is a very, very important area for work and research today. So thank you for mentioning it.
So we actually do have advanced levels of retargeting, SUSEM in South Asia as well. And I do have people under my work who are quite aware of these things, and they have their own personal strategies, like not using, or rather using the incognito mode when they're shopping for something online and so on and so forth. Right, moving on to the next set of questions. This is from Madhavi ma'am and Rajni ma'am, and they're essentially playing on the human versus technology perspective. So Madhavi ma'am is arguing that the human experience is becoming a target for profit and profitable extraction. So where is data colonialism heading in the long term? What is at stake? And Rajni ma'am is asking, that aren't we sort of generalizing, because the focus is on technology rather than on people, and then again technology has also been at the center of resistance. I think she is alluding to the Arab Spring and how tech can be used for bettering the human experience. So if you could take these two questions together.
Yes. Thank you very much. These are great questions and lots to think about. I think where is data colonialism heading in the long term is a question that we ourselves are asking and can't provide a definite answer right now. But I think we can sort of begin to envision what it might look like. And I think, to me, it's very much about the normalization of some of these rationalities. So when we talked about cheap nature, the progression of cheap nature to cheap labor to cheap data, I think it's about normalizing a certain vision of the world in which it is our job to generate the data, and this data doesn't have much value. And that's why it is permissible for a corporation who has the resources, who has technological know-how, to then acquire, appropriate, extract all of this data and use it. I think what data colonialism looks like in the long term, and it's already starting to look like, is that becoming a new rationality, that becoming an unquestionable, unquestioned reality that we take for granted. And if you think about it, it is scary how quickly we have gotten here. Although there's also room for hope. And yeah, I used to ask my students when we discussed some of these issues in class, if they weren't bothered, and for many years the response was, I'm not doing anything wrong, why should I care if the government is monitoring my actions? Or I'm getting this access to these resources for free, it's okay in exchange for Facebook to collect all of this data. Those answers have started to change anecdotally. Not always, not in every case, but I think I'm hearing from students more concern. And I think I'm hearing from them more questions about, well, is this in fact okay? This exchange doesn't strike them as fair anymore. And so they're starting to ask questions, they're starting to be concerned. So that gives me hope. I think to the second question about technology and people, that's where the imagination comes from. And I think when we look, for instance, at how some teenagers are using Instagram, and instead of relying on one account, they share accounts. So in order to create noise, basically, that obfuscates and confuses the algorithms. Sure, that's not a very effective strategy. I don't think many of us are going to apply it, but it shows the kind of creativity and critical thinking that even young people are displaying these days.
Yes, and just to follow on Rajani's question that Ulises was just referring to, you're right, of course, to point out, and we agree in the book, that there have been some extraordinary advances, at least in the speed of political mobilization through social media technologies. That's totally undeniable. But our argument isn't to deny that, but it's really more to focus on the wider context of all that, which is not so much technology. I don't think it's true to say that our talk was trying to emphasize technology, but rather the new corporate vision. What we're basically saying is that connection has become possible on a scale and a speed and a depth completely without precedent in history. And that has created completely new possibilities of extraction, if you like, a new dimension of colonial extraction. Now, that could have just happened in the abstract, but the key is that it's been mobilized by corporations. We need to pay as much attention to corporate mobilization as to radical activist mobilization, because there's been a mobilization right across the global corporate sector to see this extraordinary new territory of human life as just there for the taking. That has to be resisted as a human intention because it's dominating board levels, boards and corporate planning all over the world. And it's a rationality that we have to take on. And that, you're right to say, goes far beyond the technology. It is a way of thinking about the world, just as the original colonialism involved weapons, which were extremely powerful weapons, but the most important thing was the act of imagination, that the world was just there for the taking, and that any violence was possible to get what it wanted. So we try not to put the emphasis on technology, more on the people and the visions involved, and that's what we want to challenge above all.
Right, so the last set of questions that we have for today are by Sayan and Shah, and in a way they're looking at possible solutions. So Sayan is asking if digital commons could offer a mode of resistance, and Patricia is wondering if there are any inspiring examples of decolonizing data. I know we've had a few of them that you mentioned in your answer last, but if you could take these questions, please.
Nick, you want to go first this time?
Yes, I think the last question from Patricia might be best for you because you've got your own project and that might be something to talk about. The point about the digital commons, Well, if we can invent ways of coming together around the production of data that is genuinely shared, that genuinely meets common purposes and genuinely is used to achieve common goals, then we would certainly celebrate that. And there are people working on those sorts of things. In 2 weeks' time, we're talking at the Radical Exchange Conference, which is certainly a group of people who are trying to explore those sorts of possibilities. And the philosophy of the commons is clearly part of that, because property ownership is part of the problem in dealing with data, and that has to be resisted. So I think you're right, that's the beginnings of starting things. But at the same time, just as with the original land commons, the difficulty is to ensure that you really are in control of the common land and that you're not actually borrowing it from the landowner who can't retract that at any moment, as happened in many versions of land history in the past, in Mexico and in Britain and elsewhere. So you're right, it is a potential starting point, but we have to be cautious about any one example. But Ulises, perhaps the last question links to you.
Yes, and we do, by the way, get the observation that our argument seems to be overly depressing and perhaps lacking in presenting ideas for hope, although that's certainly not our intention. Just speaking for myself, I do think as someone from the global south, maybe I do have a higher tolerance for pessimism and fatalism, but I actually see those as necessary. I think it can be misleading to think that, well, let's just let the government figure it out. Let's just let the corporations figure it out. Maybe if we complain, after a while, they will listen and they will change. I think we do need to be realistic and in some ways pessimistic. Pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will, someone said. But it's true that we are trying to present also a vision of where there's that opportunity for agency and for hope. One of the projects I started that is kind of on hold at the moment is something called the Algorithm Observatory, and there are other places doing similar work. And the idea was to work with my students to build a platform where we could compare our experiences for basically how social media algorithms treat us. When I get a particular ad on a website or on Facebook or a particular recommendation on Netflix, those are very individualized experiences. And by creating a research platform where we can collect and compare those experiences, where I can see what Davina what kinds of advertisements she's getting on Facebook and compare them to my own, and perhaps use that as a launching pad to try to reverse engineer the algorithm, to try to see how the algorithm is treating us specifically and what kinds of assumptions it is making. So that's a possibility for intervention, for, or if nothing else, for media literacy, for understanding how these things work. So those projects are just getting started. And I know there's lots of people doing work in these and other areas. So hopefully we will see the fruits of that labor soon. And I believe we have run out of time, perhaps.
Yes, this is all the time we have today. Thank you, Nicholas sir, Ulises sir,